it's so easy to want to just attack the other person because you feel attacked, right? So give people a chance. It's not going to be done exactly perfect every single time. We need room to make mistakes so that we can learn and grow. And if we don't give people the opportunity to have a mistake so they can learn and grow, then we're eliminating the whole point and purpose of evolution.
Hello, amazing Sweet Bear community. I am Amber, and we are back for another episode of the Heart Leader podcast, where our heart and our mind align. I am here with co-host Austin to dive into more of this discussion around how we can silence that inner critic. We're taking some time here in the first few weeks to talk about where that inner critic even comes from. Like, what is the origin? Where did we get this whole notion that we are not worthy somehow? And so when we understand that and we start pulling at that thread and we start to unravel all of this discussion we have inside of our hearts and inside of our heads, then we can make new choices and reprogram. So if you haven't had a moment, take it now and make certain that you hit the like and the subscribe button wherever you are listening to us. And that'll make certain that you are notified every time a new one of these episodes drops. And it helps us because the more that we have your focus, the more that we know that we're providing content that you want to see. So take a moment and just hit that subscribe button and give us a like so we know what you want to see. This week, we are focused all around the cultural aspect. We have covered what it was like to grow up as children and how some of that narrative that we have that feeds that inner critic can come from our childhood. And we talked a little bit last week around societal norms and how societal norms can do that. But there's more that feeds into it than just those two things. We also have the cultural influences that can come into play and really kind of just worm its way in there and start to feed into the narrative that we have. And we were talking before the podcast started, Austin, around how sometimes we can just default in that language that we have to think that cultural influences are around the heritage that we grow up in. But there's more to culture than just our heritage. So do you want to share what you were talking about with me around culture and what that means to you?
Absolutely. Yeah, culture, heritage, race, that is a huge part of our culture. But nowadays, when we have countries like America, and I mean plenty of other countries around the world where there's a lot of diversity, there's a lot of different traditions, which might be another word that we can kind of talk about related to culture, that are melding. And we have a world where you can connect with anyone around the world pretty much at any time instantaneously. Well, these perceived boundaries and separation have really kind of fallen away, right?
Yeah.
And so when we view culture now, it's really about, it could be everything from religion and faith to politics to the country that you're a part of. I mean, there's so many aspects of what makes the culture, and it could be in depth. It could be everything from food to how we interact with each other um, to our communication styles and to body language. I mean, there's so much to what we wear. I mean, there's so many aspects of what it means to have cultural norms. And so as we're talking about childhood experiences into societal norms, into cultural norms, you'll see a lot of common threads and patterns because
Yeah.
honestly, they're very interwoven. I mean, there isn't a separation in that. But it's important for us to have this conversation, to be able to identify, and that will help us be able to be really intentional and purposeful in understanding where the inner critic comes from, these aspects, not to parse ourselves into separate aspects of who we are, but to help us understand ourselves and ask ourselves the right question, and then to help us grow and evolve into the person we truly desire to be, our authentic selves. And we can't do that until we really view ourselves from the whole picture.
Exactly. It's like us as beings, right?
Yeah.
We are multifaceted. And it's not as though there's just one part of our personality.
Yeah.
We have so many different parts just in our own personality, let alone like what makes us up as biological beings. Well, it's the same when we start to integrate out into the world, right? There are so many different ways that we integrate out into the world. And each one of those sends something right back to us. And if we are really mindful, we're taking the time to look at each one of those threads, look at how each one of those is feeding right back into me as a being, and understanding, all right, I'm a multifaceted being and there are multiple threads feeding right back into me. How are each one of those hitting each one of my facets?
Mm.
And okay, I don't need to get overwhelmed by this and I don't need to get bogged down in it, but I should at least take a moment every day. Let me take like 30 minutes and say, okay, I think I'm going to look at this one today and see how this thread, the cultural norms, feeds into how the inner critic is playing on this part of what I'm talking to myself about. If I always say that I am comparing myself to others around me in the workplace, well, did cultural norms play into that? Did I grow up in a culture, whether that is a spiritual culture or a religious culture that had a very strong hierarchy? Or was there something going on in there where there was comparison, not in a negative way, because it's not always a negative. We want to blame, right?
Mm.
It is so easy. The blame game is so easy. But it could be that in order to create structure, there was a hierarchy. And then there was comparison to understand what we needed to do to move through that hierarchy, right? It's a pretty structured way to do things. It helps us identify and understand what is necessary. But if we already had a negative inner critic talking, then we might start to say, oh, well, they're comparing me and I'll never get there because I'm not smart enough. Well, inherently, the system didn't do anything, but you already had an inner voice going on. So, how then do I take a step back and say, oh, I see how that fed into this? And now I can create a system within me that unplugs me from that. And I know, like, I'm not going to blame the system. I'm going to know that that's not a system that fits for me because I'm more freeform than that. I don't fit well in hierarchies and comparison structures because those trigger an inner critic voice in me. So maybe I should move into something that's more freeform and not structured.
Mm.
That makes sense?
Absolutely. I love that. I feel like what you did was really express how it's important to be free and to have free form, but it's not an either or
Yeah.
in terms of structure. Like we can have structure, we can have ideas like a hierarchy without one being above another, with there being things like unity and a oneness and respect and understanding. And so I feel like what you just presented was really good. It's easy to get caught in the state of duality where it has to be one or the other. It's just that's how most things are presented, right? It's how we tend to learn, especially when we're young. It's this or that. Like that's how we start to see how we fit into something that is our environment around us, right?
Which is the whole root of comparison,
Yes.
right? If it's duality, then there's comparison.
Mhm.
And if it's coexistence, then there's no reason for comparison. So
Beautifully
sorry, I
said.
didn't mean to.
No, it's perfect, and that's exactly right. And so I feel like your explanation really made it make sense. Like, hey, we can have structure and we can have intention and purpose, as we've talked about. And we'll continue to talk about how important intention and purpose is. And structure is a facilitation of that intention and purpose. But we can still be free form and we can not let it go from the outside to the in, but approach it from the inside to the out. When we go from the inside to the out, things like uh, unity and uniformity don't get interwoven,
Yeah.
right? Because that's a complete misunderstanding. between the two. It's easy because they're very similar in term, they're very similar in a structure, but I would say one is more free form and one is comparison based, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what I feel like we're going to really dive into today.
So, to put some constructs around what we mean by cultural influences or cultural norms,
Mhm.
from what we would offer, it is those, it's kind of like the bumper rails on if you are part of this culture, whether it is, a club that or some type of a society that has created a culture within it,
Mhm.
or it is a religion, or it is anything. Maybe it's the area in which you have grown up. So here in the United States, we have a culture of being because by locale, we have certain things that we have adopted as our cultural norms.
Mhm.
And so when you think of Americans, there are certain things you automatically think of that are our structure of behaviors, our patterns of doing things. And so as parents raise children, there are certain things that they teach these children just to understand the society and the culture in which they are raised. And we'll talk about what some of those entail. Now, again, it can be everything from the political system as well. And there are cultures within political systems. There are cultures within work organizations. You
Corporate
talk
cultures.
about corporate culture all of the time. And so when you understand the rules of engagement,
Mm.
we call it that a lot. Here are your standard rules of engagement, but they're often unspoken, unwritten rules of engagement, which makes them even more confusing sometimes. Because when they are undocumented, unspoken, and then you feel kind of a pull against them, it's easy for that inner critic to start thinking you're the one that's broken because everyone else seems to get it
Mhm.
and you don't.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super confusing. We were talking about that with
Yeah,
golf, right? The unspoken culture of golf, right? And it's
exactly.
like,
Yeah.
you know, I love
Whenever someone's at a golf course, I'm like, how am I supposed to know that I can't walk that way? And you're like, well, it's an unspoken rule, hon. And
yeah.
it's like, how am I supposed to
You're
know?
like, yeah, no, it's true. I mean, it had to have been obviously it had to have been spoken at one point, and so, but sometimes there's these unfair expectations placed on it that if you engage into something new, like you haven't played golf your whole life, for example, so you wouldn't be indoctrinated into the golf culture, and so as someone who does have experience in that, like myself, for over 2 decades of time playing golf, um, gosh, no, it's over 3 decades now. Aging myself here. Uh, and but yeah, it's over time you learn these things. But if you're, for example, not played a lot of golf in your life, and so when something comes up, it's like there's this air of expectation that you should just know it. And how unfair is that, right? That it's like why would you know? You haven't been experienced in that understanding. So when you're walking, you think it's totally fine to walk there, and in most cases and most times in life, it would be okay to walk in that way. But in golf, like you might be unintentionally walking over someone's line, and depending on the golfer, that line either goes past the hole or doesn't go past the hole. Like for I don't care if someone walks around the backside, like around the other side of the green, because it's not interrupting my flow, right? Because I don't plan on being way beyond it. But some golfers are very like, hey, don't even get around that side of it too. So you're just like you're kind of stuck. And if people don't communicate that, and then there's this expectation placed on you to understand it, but you've never been communicated to it, then it's just breeding failure across the board,
Yes.
right? And I feel like that, and we're using this example of golf because it's it's a little bit more low key in its approach in terms of it being a culture, but
And it's a deep culture.
it is a deep culture.
It's a very
Um,
deep culture.
but there's not you just don't see a lot of things on the internet saying, oh, I've been triggered by this golf culture.
Yeah,
It's like, so
true.
that's why I'm just using it as
Yeah.
kind of like a really low key approach. But I think the same like what occurs in other cultures and these unspoken understandings and these experiences and these expectations we place on each other without taking the time to, one, explain them, or two, really seek to understand them from our own perspective, and three, uh, be aware that maybe not everyone understands them, and that's okay. I think that that flows into something like golf, and then you can see it. It's in massive things like politics and nationalism and faith and religion and science, and all these corporate culture and all these different types of cultures that make up who we are. And man, I mean, if you look at one person and they are, they work, so there's a corporate culture. They have a faith in some way, so there's some type of culture related to that. They're part of a heritage or a race, whether that's one or multiple. Well, there's that. Then you have
Family.
family on top of that. Then you have maybe the nation that you're from, and then maybe the sub-region in which you're from. Oh, come on. I mean, how do you keep it all straight? Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
No wonder we're all confused.
Yes. And then if there is a part of you, and we'll go through some of these, where there is something pulling against what you've been shown as the unspoken or even the spoken
Mm.
rules within those cultural feed-ins, how does that influence that inner critic
Mm.
and that inner voice that's telling you, well, look, if this is how it's all happening out here, and this is the expectation outside, what does that mean for me inside? Right. And there are many, I know we talk to so many who are navigating this right now because we are social beings. We desire so much to connect with those that we care about, especially within our cultural contexts, right?
Mm.
There's a reason we've chosen the cultures that we are engaged in. The world is too open now. If we do not desire to be in the culture that we are in, there are opportunities for many, not all, but many, to navigate into a new culture.
Yeah.
But if we're connected in that culture, there is a desire to connect. So it does really begin to impact that inner critic. And we need tools and resources to assist us in redirection, even if that is to speak out and say, I honor this culture and I honor the way that it is. But for me, this is what I need to be within the context of this culture,
Mhm.
and understand that both can be possible.
Yeah.
Because, and I'll use golf, right? I know I watched what happened when another approach to golf came in and said, let's shake this up a little bit. Let's offer a new approach to culture within the existing culture of golf.
Mhm.
And if anybody is an avid golf enthusiast, they probably watched as golf itself went for a little bit. And there were two sides of the fence, and there were people who were just fighting over the tradition, the honor, and the culture of golf.
Mhm.
But there was a group that said, look, there should be other options. They were holding to what they felt could be an uplift in a culture. And so, what does that mean? And how did that set off inner critics and outer critics? Not just inner, but how did that set it off? And how can you, as a person, observe that from a cultural standpoint? And then ask yourself, how does that reflect anything that's going on inside of me?
Mm.
Because sometimes it's helpful to look at something outside, see how it's occurring there, and then go, oh, how does that reflect anything that's happening inside of me? Because then I don't have an emotional tie to that, but I can really observe it. This is where the science nerdy part of me comes
I
in.
love it. Show it, baby.
Because there is something from being the observer, what we call the observer standpoint, that then gives you the logical distance and emotional separation that then you can internalize and objectively see yourself in a new way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I did with the whole golf scenario when it came to culture.
I love it, and I'm glad you're highlighting that because I think it's important when we talk about an inside to out versus an outside to in approach. We're not really speaking at it from a duality standpoint. We're not saying don't take things from outside of you and bring them internally. We're saying just don't stop there. And I feel like that's what you're presenting, right? So yeah, it's a huge part of being a human. We need to understand how we fit into things. We need to look outside of ourselves and pull them in. The problem is we've been kind of taught to stop there and let that define what's going on inside. So we're always working. I mean, we're constantly getting information. I mean, just even whether it's our eyes or from all of our senses or however we're using it, it's always there's always information coming out from the outside to the in. But I love how you're presenting is like, hey, don't just stop there. Take it within yourself and then understand how it works within you and then place it from the inside to the out. So then you're in direction. You're in your authentic expression. You are determining how you're going to think, say, act, feel, etc. I think that's a key aspect to this. And then again, it turns into the coexistence aspect versus the duality. So it goes from the outside to the in, and then the inside to the out. And then that just becomes a beautiful flow that you become in direction of versus letting the outside define who you are.
Yeah. Well, and for me, it goes to the laws of the universe. And we do have a whole series over that. But there is the as above, so below, as within, so without, right? Basically, it's the whole principle of replication. Things are going to find that the property of being same, right? And so if you see something occurring in your external environment, there really isn't a way that it isn't going to find a way to impact your internal environment.
Mm-hmm.
This same is true for whatever's happening. Think about the cosmos, right? If we're having these solar flares and radiation and there are things being released from the sun, it's going to find its way into our atmosphere at some point. Likewise, if we do something silly on our planet, it will find its way to outside of our atmosphere and into space, right? It is all same. It's going to create impacts. The thing is, we get to choose the environments, and this goes to the cultural aspect of this, right? We get to choose the environments that we permit to influence our internal.
Mm-hmm.
Being conscious, sentient beings, we have this amazing gift of choice, this wonderful gift that we can say, okay, I can observe the influences that are around me. And then I can say, I know that that will influence my internal. I cannot pretend that it will not. Therefore, what am I going to do in order to place myself in environments that I desire to impact my internal?
Mm-hmm.
And then I know I'm building the type of internal I want. Likewise, what I am processing internally and what I am becoming internally in every moment, for me, love. Every moment I am becoming deeper and deeper a reflection of love, which means that my external will consistently become a deeper and deeper expression of love. So it will always be the same. So I feel like that helps a lot with the inner critic too, right? So if you are in a situation or a culture that is a heavily critical culture, you're going to be feeding that inner critic. You choose.
Right. That's well said. And it is tough. We do want to preface that sometimes things can be an easy choice. Sometimes things can be a tough choice. We're not putting a blanket statement on anything. There are situations in this world that you and I just can't have any relation to, that people are experiencing right now, that, it's when it says, oh, it's as easy as a choice, it is and it isn't, right? So we do want to make sure that we are aware and understanding of that, especially when it comes to those you love, when it is family or culture, the people around you, and um, maybe you think differently or desire to act differently, and doesn't make one right or wrong in that sense. That's I don't know, that's a whole other discussion in terms of, I mean, that's a perspective more than anything.
Yeah.
Um, but when we can start to view ourselves in that way, if we think differently or we act differently or we desire to, and we start to make those choices that reflect otherwise, we can say from our own perspective that that doesn't make us wrong. That doesn't make us. I want to be careful with my words because I guess it depends on the action. But if our goal, let's just use, if our goal is to be more loving and caring and compassionate and have those kind of actions, and so our thinking therefore becomes more loving to ourselves. Our actions, how we approach ourselves and others, become more loving towards, and then even our feelings and just the way we just kind of, our very being becomes more focused on love. um, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a quote unquote wrong in that. um, Maybe I'm getting a little too nuanced here, and I know it's tough because you can say one thing and it could come off in multiple ways, and so I'm doing my best to be aware, um, that there are extremes to everything that we're saying, and so
Yeah.
we're not saying this in complete
Blanket
blanket
statements.
statements. So I'm
Exactly.
just attempting to be focused with what I'm saying,
Yeah.
but also provide a framework for people to make a choice in that, even if someone is, maybe it's against a cultural norm to do something, um, in one specific culture, but in multiple others, it's accepted. For example, um, okay, maybe start to look at that and understand for yourself. Okay, is that, if I'm not hurting someone else in my own action, then and I'm being my authentic self, and I'm feeling that compassion, that love for who I am, and I'm expressing who I am, then maybe this is what's best for me. Not that it's right or wrong, it's just what's best for me.
Yes. And ultimately, regardless of the type of culture we're in, and let's put it in a work culture
Yeah,
scenario.
yeah, that's good.
So we know that we cannot, at this time, and this has happened to me in my past, at that time, I could not exit the work culture I was in due to necessity. But that also empowered me to know that I could make a choice when I was in that work culture to at least an hour or 2 hours a day surround myself in some positive way
Mm,
so that I could uplift myself during the time that I was there, because the rest of the culture was pretty much soul crushing.
mm,
So, what could I do that would uplift me and give me those positive moments so that I didn't allow myself to drown in the other negative feeders in that I was getting? And it was almost like my lifeline while I was there. But I had the conscious awareness to feel how much I was drowning while I was there.
mhm,
We always, some others would, and I would laugh and say it was like our soul was being sucked out through our belly buttons,
mm,
right? It was just one of those things. And I don't know how many others may have that feeling sometimes when they go into, and it didn't make the culture wrong. It didn't. It just made it not a fit for me.
yeah.
Others were so happy there. They were thriving. They loved the culture. It did not align for me personally. And so then I needed to find a way a couple hours during my time there, because I would put in like 14, 16-hour days while I was there. So taking a couple of hours while I was there to listen to music that uplifted me, or do exercises that uplifted me, then gave me that positive boost that got me through the other 12 to 14 hours that I was there. So that's one way that you can do it, where the culture then isn't, you're not leaving the culture, you're understanding the culture, and you're doing what you need to do from the outside in and the inside out to keep you from being crushed by the culture.
I love that. I feel like in many ways what you're saying is it's important to find a common thread. Like a big part of pretty much every culture in this world is food, right?
Yeah.
And as I'm learning about food and we're watching little fun cooking shows, I'm seeing so many different types of food used in different ways, but it seems to be a staple in multiple cultures, right? Something like as simple as onions or garlic. Someone came from, an Italian culture, like I'm used to those being very Italian focused. But as we're exploring different types of food, it's like, well, it's used pretty much in every food in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't make Italian the only right way to utilize onions and garlic, right?
Exactly.
No, there's other beautiful expressions of it.
Like the bloomin' onion.
Like, yeah, hey, there we go. Exactly. Exactly. So, and I think music's very much the same way. I mean, you could have one note, and that note can be used in multiple different types of music, right? There's different genres, different approaches, different feels, and when paired together, it creates a harmony, right? I mean, it's really rare that people listen to music that's not in harmony, right? It's almost like it's like a physical like cringe, right? But when you hear those notes used in a harmony, and then that harmony can be used in different types of genres, everything from classical to jazz to, rap, alternative. I mean, you name it. It can be used in so many different types, EDM, everything. Then the overarching theme is that harmony is the key. And so when we can kind of place that thread and understand, hey, we might be that one note attempting to find harmony in another and then create, be a part of a genre that we like, well, then it's stemming from that inside to the out and allowing us to express ourselves in a unique way without making the others worse. It's not like any of the other types of genres are wrong. They're just different viewpoints. They make music as a collective.
Exactly. Exactly. And again, that comes back to, and you're going to hear us say this so many times, but when we desire to blame the world outside of us, then we are robbing ourselves of an opportunity to learn about ourselves.
Mm.
And so the world around us isn't inherently doing something wrong. It is simply doing something different than what fits for us. And so it's our opportunity to find out where that disharmony is occurring. As you said, it's like music, right? Again, if there's disharmony, we have to figure out where that misalignment is happening. And it doesn't mean anyone is personally going out and saying, I'm going to do this just to mess you up. No, maybe sometimes, maybe that's their idea of fun. But for the most part, everyone is doing what they know how to do, and things just simply aren't in harmony. So we have to figure that out. And maybe, just maybe, it's me who's not playing the right note.
Mm.
And I need to figure that out. And I need to own it.
Nice. Yeah, I love that, and that's where, as we've talked about before, we can reshape that inner critic to help us understand, and we can use it as a positive mental framework to enhance who we are and view ourselves from a true place of authenticity versus what we think we should be, who we think we should be, how we think we should act, just because everything around us is saying to do that.
And again, to circle back to this whole cultural influence, one of the ones that's in there, and it's a really big topic right now, is gender roles.
Yeah.
Right? And the influence that culture can place around gender roles. And so we're at a point now where there's more freedom than there has been in understanding what gender roles mean to each one of us. But in some cultures, and it can go across all of those that we've discussed, there are still some parameters around what gender roles mean. And with all the love in my heart, I was somewhere last week where I heard quite often, it's wonderful to see women engaging in a man's world. And as it was being said so frequently, it was being said with love. And this group was really doing their best with an open heart and an open mind to say this, to say, I am moving forward and opening myself up to this. But everything within me was feeling like, yes, this is a step forward generationally, because there's a generation stigma sometimes. Culturally, it's a step forward. But at some point, I cannot wait to begin to hear it's people's roles in a people's world.
Mm-hmm.
And then even beyond that, and you said it too, it's just roles within our world.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not even just a people's world. There are so many diverse beings here, from plants to animals to, it's just choosing a role within the world, regardless of race, gender, cultural, none of it matters. But we are making moves to get there. So even though the way this was presented was a huge step forward for this group and their gender roles and beliefs according to where they are and their cultural influences, for me, there's still so much more growth we can do. And so if we each just keep taking that step forward from a culture and we own how we're feeling, then we're going to get to that point. And so I feel like that is an opportunity for all of us to embrace, not let the inner critic, because my inner critic, of course, for a moment stepped up and was like, how does that mean that this person doesn't think that you as a woman are worthy of a man's role? That they're just saying that to be politically correct? Of course, that inner critic wanted to be right there. But then I had an opportunity to go, it's their way, this group's way of saying, look, regardless of what they may have been raised to believe, they are open to seeing things differently now. And what a huge step forward. What a huge step forward. So I can look at it that way and take it as a personal slight, or I can look at the amazing growth that we're having and then know that the next stage of growth is a people's world. So where do I choose to go?
I love that. I feel like that's for another culture, aka the cancel culture. I feel like that would be a really strong approach to help facilitate a better understanding. And all this confusion that we were talking about in the beginning of this podcast about how there's so many different things coming from outside of us telling us how to be, what to be, who to be, and all that, that it gets confusing. And then when there's unspoken rules and things that we should just know but and have experience, but we can't have the experience, and so lack of experience ends up hurting us, but we need more experience, but we can't get that experience. It's just like, oh my gosh, like I can't win, I can't do anything in life now. I'm done.
Yeah.
And so I think what you just provided was a really great approach for people to, myself included, to view things in a different perspective and start to provide compassion and understanding uh, instead of just shutting out or shutting down someone else for that thought, and start to view it, okay, hey, that might not have been the best way to say it, but I do see in their heart that what they mean is a place of love. What they mean is this openness, and that's really all we ever desire for ourselves and for those around us. Is if our goal as a species is to continue to evolve, then we need to be open to evolution. We need to be open to new ideas, to shifting and moving forward. And so we can't do that if we're just shutting everything down. So I think that's really important, because it's one thing to talk about all these different things, but another to show, hey, this is how it can actually be done.
Yeah. And if we desire someone to honor our growth,
Mm-hmm.
we have to honor the growth in others, even if it's not to the level that we've grown.
Yeah, well said.
Right. And so we're only going to navigate within ourselves and with one another to the place that we desire to be if we collectively give one another space for that growth. But if we're condemning one another because you haven't gotten as far as I have, look how far evolved I am, it's not going to do any of us any good. Because if you're doing that, you're not as evolved as you think you are.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, it's just ego.
And so through this whole cultural norm evaluation and understanding, part of it is when that was triggered in me, and I was like, whoa, what? And then I started questioning my own, like, so is this group saying that as a woman I am not good enough? Well, am I good enough? Well, but it had nothing to do with me. And so how quickly that inner critic could have put me on the defense. And when we look at these lists of cultural influences, that's how it can begin to feed that inner critic and then immediately flip us into that cancel culture that you were talking about,
Yes.
and make us so non responsive to somebody else's growth. And someone may actually be open to us being something outside of the cultural norm, but we're so then on the defense that we're not even going to hear them because we've censored anything they have to say.
Yeah. It's a really good point. I feel like another thing that you shared that's really valuable is just when you are silencing the inner critic inside, when those triggers or those things kind of come up, it's so easy to want to just attack the other person because you feel attacked, right? But one thing you shared with me is just simply asking a question. Hey, is that what you meant? Not from a condescending standpoint, but like a genuine inquiry of like, hey, is that really what you meant? Because sometimes people are saying something. It could be from a lens of cultural understanding, even though they are cultural norms that they don't even believe in. But it could be really, really simple. We're human. We make mistakes. Not everything we do comes out perfectly. And so it could just be so simple. I was like, oh man, no, you're right. I didn't mean it in that way. Let me rephrase. Like, give people a chance. It's not just, it's not going to be done exactly perfect every single time. We need room to make mistakes so that we can learn and grow. And if we don't give people the opportunity to have a mistake so they can learn and grow, then we're eliminating the whole point and purpose of evolution. And so I think just that simple question of like, hey, this is what I heard. Is that what you meant? And it might just be a mere reflection on someone else. Be like, no, actually, I really believe and mean something else. But because I've been so part of cultural norms that I'm saying in a way that I'm used to hearing everyone else hear and say. And so it just could be a great growth opportunity. Maybe that's exactly what they wanted in that moment and just didn't, they were in there. And sometimes we're all in our own way in many ways, right? So sometimes we need someone outside of ourselves to hold up that mirror and show that. And in that moment, that could be the most loving, amazing thing that we could do. And so, but we have to be willing to provide compassion and hold a space of empathy and sympathy and love and care to allow for that type of growth to occur, because we all know that growth doesn't happen painlessly. There is pain to it. It's just, if we have the opportunity to be loving in that situation, then it might make it a lot less painful than if we were to make it a worse situation just because of a choice.
Are there any other cultural norms or cultural influences? I know we're not going to be able to cover everything that we put in the book, but any others that you feel like we just got to get into this discussion to share with others?
With childhood experiences and societal norms kind of all flowing into cultural norms, I think it's pretty easy to see kind of all of the how interconnected they are. I mean, we've talked about the last two about perfectionism, and there's even a case for perfectionism being a part of a cultural norm too, right? But yeah, let's talk about a stemming thread, because it's a lot of these are symptoms. A lot of these cultural childhood experiences, cultural norms, societal norms, and childhood experiences are tend to be symptoms. So I'd really like to talk about a source, like an actual, what is the source of what's creating these symptoms? And I would say a culture of fear. I feel like that's a huge aspect that we are missing as a society, as a main source of a lot of our pain. If we can get ourselves out of this culture of fear, and then a lot of these other symptoms like shame, guilt, sadness, depression, anxiety, all the things that we experience because of expectation, and all these things that are actionable symptoms stemming from this source of fear. I think that's what's keeping us in this state of struggle. And so if we can shift our source from fear into more of love, then all those start to fall away and we start to feel confident. We start to feel connected. We start to feel compassion. We start to feel sympathy and empathy. We start to understand each other at a whole other level. That's a culture that I know I desire to be a part of, and that's what you desire to be a part of, and that's why we're here on this podcast. And everyone who's listening to some degree desires to be a part of that. But it can't flourish until we start to choose it. And so, if it is our desired source, it is what we desire to place in everything that we think, everything that we act, everything that we do, everything that we embody, then we have to be willing to choose it. The more we choose it, the more we become it. The more it just is. And so, I would say let's be more conscious and aware and intentional and purposeful behind the source of love behind what we think, feel, and do.
It's a beautiful message. And yes, I mean, fear just gets in there and it creates a lot of these issues that feed that inner critic, right?
Yeah.
I'm not good enough. I am I need to be perfect. If I'm not perfect, then I'm not loved. So it's the fear of not being loved. It's the fear of not measuring up. It's the fear of all of these things that begin to create that negative brain bias and that running monologue in the mind. And so, the number one thing, the number one tool and thing that you can do is to counteract every fearful thought with a loving one, and multiple loving ones if you can do it,
Yes.
right? And that's why that mirror technique that we're giving away with the pre order of the book is just so valuable, because it gives you that opportunity to really look at yourself in a different way and program your heart and your mind with those positive words about yourself, to feel the love for yourself,
Yeah.
so that it's just there. So I agree. Now, I would say that maybe not all of them are symptoms and a part of that root, because it can get in there and also be a root and take root. But definitely fear is an overarching, overwhelming aspect to this. And so, as you always say, you cannot, fear cannot exist where love is, but love is always present, even if there's fear.
Exactly.
So go love. Go love.
We love love.
We do. And we love all of you. So thank you very much for joining us on another episode of the Heart Leader podcast, where our heart and our mind align. I am Amber here with Austin, talking through that inner critic and how we can get it to silence. We will be here every week talking through aspects of this book. But remember, this is a collaboration. We are still in flow of writing this book, and we would love to hear from you, because our goal is to create something that will be the most beneficial for you. So if in any of these topics there are things that you would really like to hear about, then please drop us a line. You can do it right here, wherever you are watching or listening to the podcast, or you can send us a message to info, I-N-F-O, at suivera.org. And you can pre-order the book, as we mentioned just a few moments ago. We will leave a URL wherever you are watching or listening that you can simply click on, and it will take you over to a pre-order page where you can get 20% off. And you can get a copy of that class that we were talking about. It's one of our best-selling classes, and you get it for free. It is a week-long mirror technique course where you'll get worksheets and you'll get emails, and it will guide you through how to really see yourself in a wonderful, new, and loving way. Until the next time, we look forward to seeing you in the Suivera community.